friends, welcome back. I'm Christina, the manager at the Pacific Beach Library. Thank you for joining me for day 4 of our read along together of The Cricket on the Hearth by Charles Dickens. Today we're going to conclude the second section, which is called, of course, Chirp the Second, as all chapters should be about with books about cricket should be entitled Chirps, right? Okay, we'll go ahead and remind ourselves of what happened in the first part of Chirp the Second after we enjoy a little bit of tea. Today's tea that I'm enjoying is a black tea with a peach flavor, natural flavorings, I'm sure, as the tea packages often like to say. But yeah, just a basic black tea with a little bit of flavoring to it. I realized in this package I had only, well, this morning I had 3 tea bags left. Now I'm down to, after the pot of tea I had this morning and then this pot of tea, one left, and I can finish off that package. It's always exciting. Very good. Just a nice simple tea. If anyone is having something particularly splendid today, I'd love to hear about it. Let's see. Let's talk. My mind is all aflutter. Let's see. I realized I forgot to look up to see what was the vote getter. When I checked last, which was shortly before lunch, I saw that the leader at the time was The Great Gatsby. And so let me just double check and make sure that nothing changed in the time I went to lunch. Let's see. Well, I think it is The Great Gatsby. Let's check see. We have so many polls. We have so many different things that we're voting on here. Yes, okay, Great Gatsby, 10 votes. The next vote getter down was Mrs. Dalloway with 5. A Lady's Life in the Rockies by Isabella Bird had 3. I think that it is a far enough gap that we don't need to bother doing a drawing. And so I'm just going to go ahead and be bold and announce that beginning on January the 11th, we will start reading The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. Let's see. I've also reconsidered my plan to not do any readings during the first week of January. I'm taking that week off, so instead I think I'm going to go ahead and post some more videos of short stories, because I really enjoyed reading the O. Henry short story last week, The Gift of the Magi. So I'm going to look through some collections, see if I can find some short stories that I love, but if there is anything like a short story that you particularly like and that you would like to see our group read together, please go ahead and post it in the comments and let me know. And that way I can see if I can find that one. And as long as it's in the public domain, we'll give it a read. I think it'd be fun to read, just have a couple short stories to tide us over for that week. Ooh, and I see that there's some good teas out there. Judy's having an English tea time. Denise is having a rooibos with vanilla. That sounds really good. I have a hard time looking at the comments on this thing. I'm always afraid that I'm going to like turn the video off. Oh, and yay! I'm excited too for reading Great Gatsby. That is another one that I have heard much about, but I've actually never read. And so that will be fun to read. I'm assuming it is such a classic, most folks have read it already, and I think I'm a little behind on this. But perhaps I'm not the only person who's never read The Great Gatsby before. We'll find out. If you have not read it, let me know. Or if you do have read it and you'd love it, let us know that too. So our next read will be The Great Gatsby. You also still have time to vote as to what you thought was our greatest book that we read together this year. The last I saw, the front of the pack there was still Jane Eyre, which is, again, one of my favorite ever books, which is why it was the first book that our group read together, because it is my favorite book. But that said, we have read some amazing stories this year, and so there's still time to vote on that. I figure we'll announce on the 31st our group's countdown as to what we thought were the best books that we read together in 2020. So that'll be kind of fun. All right, so let's talk a little bit about Chirp the second of the 3 chapters, let's say what they are, in The Cricket on the Hearth. So Chirp the Second, what we read on Wednesday, it started out actually really, really sweet. It was telling about a minor character whom we met in the first Chirp. His name was Caleb Plummer. He is the toy maker that works for Tackleton, who is about to be wed to a younger woman and seems to be not a very nice man. But Caleb Plummer, we learn, is an incredibly nice man. He lives with his daughter, who is blind. They make a big deal about how she is the blind daughter. And of course, right now, I'm forgetting her name. I think it was with a B. Was it Brenda? Oh, Bertha, thank you. So Bertha is the blind daughter of Caleb Plummer. And what we learn in that first section of Chirp the Second is that Caleb Plummer is a very poor but hardworking and honest man, and he, in order to make circumstances seem better for his daughter, he has deceived her. He has done it with the best of intentions, but he has thoroughly deceived her about what their situation is. He has told her that they have a better house, better accommodations, better clothing, that he is richer and happier than he actually is. And it's because he doesn't want her to be saddened by the circumstances in which they live. And in fact, he has also told her that his boss, Tackleton, who is, again, not a kind man, that when he says mean things to Caleb Plummer, that really he sort of turns it aside to his daughter and he says, if you didn't see his face, you might think he was saying that seriously. But really, as he's saying these cruel things, he's winking or smiling, and it's all a game and a jest. That really, he is a very kind-hearted, considerate, caring man and boss, and we are so fortunate to live as we do. And so, because of this, the daughter has developed an unrealistic picture in her mind of what their circumstances are and also of who Tackleton is and what his character is like. And in fact, she quite admires him. And we can see this in the section when Tackleton comes in to speak to Caleb Plummer and is very rude and cruel to him, actually. But the daughter doesn't see it because her father has painted a different reality for her. And so this toy maker has used his creativity, in a sense, to make a better life than what they actually have in the real world, but he's created an imaginary world that his daughter lives in, and that he has taxed himself even further to make it seem real for her. It is both sad and beautiful because it's so kind of him to do this thing, even though it wears on him even more. But to create this imaginary world so that his daughter can live a happier life, it's a very, very kind thing. And so, the daughter is, of course, disturbed to hear that the Tackleton is going to be wed because she has actually feelings for Tackleton. I mean, believing him to be their benefactor, to being a kind, caring man. And so she's disappointed that Mr. Tackleton will, even though she is happy for him and his joy that he's to be wed, she's disappointed that he's going to be, leaving them basically. And yeah, that he has chosen someone other than her. By the way, Tackleton sees the blind daughter as being something is wrong with her. Clearly, she must be mentally deficient. The way she acts, because he knows who he is, he knows he's not a kind man, and yet the way she acts, it's like he thinks that she must be. There's something wrong with her mind for her to treat him as kindly as she does, and he doesn't understand that she actually believes him to be a kind person, and that's why she behaves as she does towards him. It's again very it's poignant. It's a really well done, interesting scene. All right, so then the section that we read on Wednesday, concluded with Mrs. Peerybingle getting ready to go to visit Caleb Plummer's home so she can have lunch with a picnic lunch with Bertha, the daughter. And when Tackleton had gone to visit Caleb Plummer and his daughter, he had said that he wanted to basically crash that little luncheon because he wants to bring his fiancée, the younger woman who is an acquaintance of Dot Peerybingle, so they can basically so he can kind of like gain the favor of his fiancée, who obviously doesn't love him. So they're getting ready to go, and the carrier, John mentions, because the carrier is going to drive his wife over in his carriage to Bertha Plummer's home. And, there's a little bit of talk about how the older gentleman that's rooming with them seems to be an odd fish, but, there's no harm in him. And it's just, there's a nice little bit just about as they're driving along, as they're in the carriage on their way over to the Plummer home, that they're riding along in silence, but it's not silent for long because so many people stop to hail John Peerybingle and to wish him well and to say how are you, and even to ride alongside them, their cart. And it's just, again, as I mentioned the other day, comparing it to Ebenezer Scrooge in our last reading of A Christmas Story, this idea of John Peerybingle is a good person. He's somebody who invites the confidences of others, who's a kind, fair person. And so because of that, people flock to him. And so it's just very nicely done establishing who he is, that all these people love him so much. All right, so now let's go ahead and continue the conclusion of Chirp the Second and find out what is going on in this story. All right, continuing on. Where I'm going to just read the last paragraph or last sentence of the previous chapter, or excuse me, the previous reading, so we can continue along. Wherever he went, somebody or other might have been heard to cry, "Hello, here's Boxer," and out came that somebody forthwith, accompanied by at least 2 or 3 other somebodies, to give John Peerybingle and his pretty wife good day. The packages and parcels for the errand cart were numerous, and there were many stoppages to take them in and give them out, which were not by any means the worst parts of the journey. Some people were so full of expectation about their parcels, and other people were so full of wonder about their parcels, and other people were so full of inexhaustible directions about their parcels, and John had such a lively interest in all the parcels, that it was as good as a play. Likewise, there were articles to carry, which required to be considered and discussed, and in reference to the adjustment and disposition of which, counsels had to be holden by the carrier and the senders, at which Boxer usually assisted in short fits of the closest attention, and long fits of tearing round and round the assembled sages, and barking himself hoarse. Of all these little incidents, Dot was the amused and open-eyed spectatress from her chair in the cart, and as she sat there looking on, a charming little portrait framed to admiration by the tilt, there was no lack of nudgings and glancings and whisperings and envyings among the younger men. And this delighted John the carrier beyond measure, for he was proud to have his little wife admired, knowing that she didn't mind it, that if anything, she rather liked it, perhaps. The trip was a little foggy, to be sure, in the January weather, and was raw and cold, but who cared for such trifles? Not Dot, decidedly, not Tilly Slowboy, for she deemed sitting in a cart, on any terms, to be the highest point of human joys, the crowning circumstance of earthly hopes. Not the baby, I'll be sworn, for it's not in baby nature to be warmer or more sound asleep, though its capacity is great in both respects, than that blessed young Peerybingle was, all the way. You couldn't see very far in the fog, of course, but you could see a great deal. It's astonishing how much you may see in a thicker fog than that, if you will only take the trouble to look for it. Why, even to sit watching for the fairy rings in the fields, and for the patches of hoarfrost still lingering in the shade, near hedges and by trees, was a pleasant occupation, to make no mention of the unexpected shapes in which the trees themselves came starting out of the mist, and glided into it again. The hedges were tangled and bare, and waved a multitude of blighted garlands in the wind. But there was no discouragement in this. It was agreeable to contemplate, for it made the fireside warmer in possession, and the summer greener in expectancy. The river looked chilly, but it was in motion, and moving at a good pace, which was a great point. The canal was rather slow and torpid, that must be admitted. Never mind. It would freeze the sooner when the frost set fairly in, and there would be skating and sliding, and the heavy old barges frozen up somewhere near a wharf would smoke their rusty iron chimney pipes all day and have a lazy time of it. In one place there was a great mound of weeds or stubble burning, and they watched the fire, so white in the daytime, flaring through the fog, with only here and there a dash of red in it, until in consequence, as she observed of the smoke getting up her nose, Miss Slowboy choked, she could do anything of that sort, or the smallest provocation, and woke the baby, who wouldn't go to sleep again. But Boxer, who was in advance some quarter of a mile or so, had already passed the outposts of the town, and gained to the corner of the street where Caleb and his daughter lived, and long before they had reached the door, he and the blind girl were on the pavement waiting to receive them. Boxer, by the way, made certain delicate distinctions of his own in his communication with Bertha, which persuade me fully that he knew her to be blind. He never sought to attract her attention by looking at her, as he often did with other people, but touched her invariably. What experience he could ever have had of blind people or blind dogs, I don't know. He had never lived with a blind master, nor had Mr. Boxer the elder, nor Mrs. Boxer, nor any of his respectable family on either side ever been visited with blindness that I am aware of. He may have found it out for himself, perhaps, but he had got hold of it somehow, and therefore he had hold of Bertha too by the skirt, and kept hold until Mrs. Peerybingle and the baby, and Miss Slowboy and the basket were all got safely within doors. May Fielding was already come, and so was her mother, a little querulous chip of an old lady with a peevish face, who, in right of having preserved a waist like a bedpost, was supposed to be a most transcendent figure, and who, in consequence of having once been better off, or of laboring under an impression that she might have been, if something had happened which never did happen, and seemed to have never been particularly likely to come to pass, but it's all the same, was very genteel and patronizing indeed. Gruff and Tackleton was also there, doing the agreeable, with the evident sensation of being as perfectly at home and as unquestionably in his own element as a fresh young salmon on the top of the Great Pyramid. May, my dear old friend, cried Dot, running up to meet her. What a happiness to see you! Her old friend was, to the full, as hearty and as glad as she, and it really was, if you'll believe me, quite a pleasant sight to see them embrace. Tackleton was a man of taste beyond all question. May was very pretty. You know sometimes, when you are used to a pretty face, how, when it comes into contact and comparison with another pretty face, it seems for the moment to be homely and faded and hardly to deserve the high opinion you have had of it. Now, this was not at all the case, either with Dot or May, for May's face set off Dot's, and Dot's face set off May's, so naturally and agreeably that, as John Peerybingle was very near saying when he came into the room, they ought to have been born sisters, which was the only improvement you could have suggested. Tackleton had brought his leg of mutton, and, wonderful to relate, a tart besides. But we don't mind a little dissipation when our brides are in the case. We don't get married every day, and in addition to these dainties, there were the veal and ham pie, and things, as Mrs. Peerybingle called them, which were chiefly nuts and oranges and cakes and such small deer. When the repast was set forth on the board, flanked by Caleb's contribution, which was a great wooden bowl of smoking potatoes, he was prohibited by solemn compact from producing any other viands. Tackleton led his intended mother-in-law to the post of honor. For the better gracing of this place at the high festival, the majestic old soul had adorned herself with a cap, calculated to inspire the thoughtless with sentiments of awe. She also wore her gloves. But let us be genteel or die. Caleb sat next to his daughter. Dot and her old schoolfellow were side by side. The good carrier took care of the bottom of the table. Miss Slowboy was isolated, for the time being, from every article of furniture but the chair she sat on, that she might have nothing else to knock the baby's head against. As Tilly stared about her at the dolls and toys, they stared at her and at the company. The venerable old gentlemen at the street doors, who were all in full action, showed a special interest in the party, pausing occasionally before leaping, as if they were listening to the conversation, and then plunging wildly over and over a great many times without halting for breath, as in a frantic state of delight with the whole proceedings. Certainly, if these old gentlemen were inclined to have a fiendish joy in the contemplation of Tackleton's discomfiture, they had good reason to be satisfied. Tackleton couldn't get on at all, and the more cheerful his intended bride became in Dot's society, the less he liked it, though he had brought them together for that purpose. For he was a regular dog in the manger, was Tackleton, and when they laughed and he couldn't, he took it into his head immediately that they must be laughing at him. "Ah, May," said Dot, "dear, dear, what changes! To talk of those merry school days makes one young again." "Why, you aren't particularly old at any time, are you?" said Tackleton. "Look at my sober, plodding husband there," returned Dot. He adds 20 years to my age at least. Don't you, John? 40, John replied. How many you'll add to May's, I am sure I don't know, said Dot, laughing. But she can't be much less than 100 years of age on her next birthday. Ha ha, laughed Tackleton. Hollow as a drum, that laugh, though, and he looked as if he could have twisted Dot's neck comfortably. Dear, dear, said Dot, only to remember how we used to talk at school about the husbands we would choose. I don't know how young and how handsome and how gay and how lively mine was not to be. And as to May's, ah dear, I don't know whether to laugh or cry when I think what silly girls we were. May seemed to know which to do, for the color flushed into her face, and tears stood in her eyes. Even the very persons themselves, real live young men, were fixed on sometimes, said Dot. We little thought how things would come about. I never fixed on John, I'm sure. I never so much as thought of him. And if I had told you you were ever to be married to Mr. Tackleton, why, you'd have slapped me. Wouldn't you, May? Though May didn't say yes, she certainly didn't say no, or express no, by any means. Tackleton laughed. Quite shouted, he laughed so loud. John Peerybingle laughed too, in his ordinary good-natured and contented manner, but his was a mere whisper of a laugh to Tackleton's. You couldn't help yourselves for all that. You couldn't resist us, you see, said Tackleton. Here we are, here we are. Where are your gay young bridegrooms now? Some of them are dead, said Dot, and some of them are forgotten. Some of them, if they could stand among us at this moment, would not believe we were the same creatures, would not believe that what they saw and heard was real, and we could forget them so. No, they would not believe one word of it. Why, Dot, exclaimed the carrier, little woman. She had spoken with such earnestness and fire that she stood in need of some recalling to herself, without doubt. Her husband's check was very gentle, for he merely interfered, as he supposed, to shield old Tackleton. But it proved effectual, for she stopped and said no more. There was an uncommon agitation, even in her silence, which the wary Tackleton, who had brought his half-shut eye to bear upon her, noted closely, and remembered to some purpose too. May uttered no word, good or bad, but sat quite still, with her eyes cast down, and made no sign of interest in what had passed. The good lady, her mother, now interposed, observing, in the first instance, that girls were girls, and bygones bygones, and that so long as young people were young and thoughtless, they would probably conduct themselves like young and thoughtless persons, with two or three other positions of a no less sound and incontrovertible character. She then remarked, in a devout spirit, that she thanked heaven she had always found in her daughter May a dutiful and obedient child, for which she took no credit to herself, though she had every reason to believe it was entirely owing to herself. With regard to Mr. Tackleton, she said, that he was in a moral point of view an undeniable individual, and that he was in an eligible point of view a son-in-law to be desired. No one in their senses could doubt. She was very emphatic here. With regard to the family into which he was so soon about, after some solicitation, to be admitted, she believed Mr. Tackleton knew that, although reduced in purse, it had some pretensions to gentility, and if certain circumstances, not wholly unconnected, she would go so far as to say, with the indigo trade, but to which she would not more particularly refer, had happened differently, it might perhaps have been in possession of wealth. She then remarked that she would not allude to the past, and would not mention that her daughter had for some time rejected the suit of Mr. Tackleton, and that she would not say a great many other things, which she did say at great length. Finally, she delivered it as general result of her observation and experience that those marriages in which there was at least of what was romantically and sillily called love were always the happiest, and that she anticipated the greatest possible amount of bliss, not rapturous bliss, but the solid, steady-going article from the approaching nuptials. She concluded by informing the company that tomorrow was the day she had lived for expressly, and that when it was over she would desire nothing better than to be packed up and disposed of in any genteel place of burial. As these remarks were quite unanswerable, which is the happy property of all remarks that are sufficiently wide of the purpose, they changed the current of the conversation, and diverted the general attention to the veal and ham pie, the cold mutton, the potatoes, and the tart. In order that the bottled beer might not be slighted, John Peerybingle proposed tomorrow, the wedding day, and called upon them to drink a bumper to it before he proceeded on his journey. For you ought to know that he only rested there, and gave the old horse a bait. He had to go some 4 or 5 miles farther on, and when he returned in the evening, he called for Dot, and took another rest on his way home. This was the order of the day on all the picnic occasions, and had been ever since their institution. There were only 2 persons present, besides the bride and bridegroom-elect, who did but indifferent honor to the toast. One of these was Dot, too flushed and discomposed to adapt herself to any small occurrence of the moment. The other Bertha, who rose up hurriedly before the rest, and left the table. "Good-bye," said stout John Peerybingle, pulling on his dreadnought coat. "I shall be back at the old time. Good-bye, all." "Good-bye, John," returned Caleb. He seemed to say it by rote, and to wave his hand in the same unconscious manner, for he stood observing Bertha with an anxious, wondering face that never altered its expression. "Good-bye, young shaver," said the jolly carrier, bending down to kiss the child, which Tilly Slowboy, now intent upon her knife and fork, had deposited asleep, and, strange to say, without damage, in a little cot of Bertha's furnishing. "Good-bye. Time will come, I suppose, when you'll turn out into the cold, my little friend, and leave your old father to enjoy his pipe and his rheumatics in the chimney-corner, eh? Where's Dot?" "I'm here, John," she said, starting. "Come, come," returned the carrier, clapping his sounding hands. "Where's the pipe?" "I quite forgot the pipe, John." Forgot the pipe? Was such a wonder ever heard of? She forgot the pipe. I'll fill it directly. It's soon done." But it was not so soon done, either. It lay in the usual place, the carrier's dreadnought pocket, with the little pouch, her own work, from which she was used to fill it. But her hand shook so that she entangled it, and yet her hand was small enough to have come out easily, I am sure, and bungled terribly. The filling of the pipe and lighting it, those little offices in which I have commended her discretion, were vilely done, from first to last. During the whole process Tackleton stood looking on maliciously with a half-closed eye, which, whenever it met hers, or caught it, for it can hardly be said to have ever met another eye, rather being a kind of trap to snatch it up, augmented her confusion in a most remarkable degree. "Why, what a clumsy Dot you are this afternoon," said John. "I could have done it better myself, I verily believe." With these good-natured words he strode away, and presently was heard, in company with Boxer and the old horse and the cart, making lively music down the road. What time the dreamy Caleb still stood, watching his blind daughter, with the same expression on his face. "Bertha," said Caleb softly, "what has happened? How changed you are, my darling, in a few hours, since this morning. You, silent and dull all day. What is it? Tell me." "Oh, father, father!" cried the blind girl, bursting into tears. "Oh, my hard, hard fate!" Caleb drew his hand across his eyes before he answered her. "But think how cheerful and how happy you have been, Bertha! How good, and how much loved by many people!" "That strikes me to the heart, dear father. always so mindful of me, always so kind to me." Caleb was very much perplexed to understand her. To be to be blind, Bertha, my poor dear, he faltered, is a great affliction, but I have never felt it, cried the blind girl. I have never felt it in its fullness. Never. I have sometimes wished that I could see you or could see him. Only once, dear father, only for one little minute, that I might know what it is I treasure up. She laid her hands upon her breast, and hold here, that I might be sure and have it right. And sometimes, but then I was a child, I have wept in my prayers at night to think that when your images ascended from my heart to heaven, they might not be the true resemblance of yourselves. But I have never had these feelings long. They have passed away and left me tranquil and contented. And they will again, said Caleb. But father, oh my good, gentle father, bear with me if I am wicked, said the blind girl. This is not the sorrow that so weighs me down. Her father could not choose but let his moist eyes overflow. She was so earnest and pathetic, but he did not understand her yet. Bring her to me, said Bertha. I cannot hold it closed and shut within myself. Bring her to me, father. She knew he hesitated and said, May! Bring May! May heard the mention of her name, and coming quietly towards her, touched her on the arm. The blind girl turned immediately and held her by both hands. Look into my face, dear heart. Sweet heart, said Bertha. Read it with your beautiful eyes, and tell me if the truth is written on it. Dear Bertha, yes. The blind girl still, upturning the blank, sightless face, down which the tears were coursing fast, addressed her in these words. There is not in my soul a wish or thought that is not for your good, bright May. There is not in my soul a grateful recollection stronger than the deep remembrance which is stored there of the many, many times when, in the full pride of sight and beauty, you have had consideration for blind Bertha, even when we two were children, or when Bertha was as much a child as ever blindness can be. Every blessing on your head, light upon your happy course. Not the less, my dear May, and she drew towards her in a closer grasp, not the less, my bird, because today the knowledge that you are to be his wife has wrung my heart almost to breaking. Father, May, Mary, oh, forgive me that it is so, for the sake of all he has done to relieve the weariness of my dark life, and for the sake of the belief you have in me, when I call heaven to witness that I could not wish him married to a wife more worthy of his goodness. While speaking, she had released May Fielding's hands and clasped her garments in an attitude of mingled supplication and love. Sinking lower and lower down as she proceeded in her strange confession, she dropped at last to the feet of her friend and hid her blind face in the folds of her dress. Great power! Exclaimed her father, smitten at one blow with the truth. Have I deceived her from her cradle, but to break her heart at last? It was well for all of them that Dot, that beaming, useful, busy little Dot, for such she was, whatever faults she had, and however you may learn to hate her in good time. It was well for all of them, I say, that she was there, for where this would have ended it were hard to tell. But Dot, recovering her self-possession, interposed before May could reply, or Caleb say another word. Come here, dear Bertha. Come away with me. Give her your arm, May. So. How composed she is, you see, already, and how good it is of her to mind us, said the cheery little woman, kissing her upon the forehead. Come away, dear Bertha. Come, and here's her good father will come with her, won't you, Caleb? To be sure. Well, well, she was a noble little Dot in such things, and it must have been an obdurate nature that could have withstood her influence. When she had got poor Caleb and his Bertha away, that they might comfort and console each other, as she knew they only could, she presently came bouncing back, The saying is, as fresh as any daisy. I say fresher, to mount guard over that bridling little piece of consequence in the cap and gloves, and prevent the dear old creature from making discoveries. So, bring me the precious baby, Tilly, said she, drawing a chair to the fire. And while I have it in my lap, here's Mrs. Fielding, Tilly. Here's Mrs. Fielding. Tilly will tell me all about the management of babies and put me right in 20 points where I'm as wrong as can be. Won't you, Mrs. Fielding? Not even the Welsh giant, who, according to the popular expression, was so slow as to perform a fatal surgical operation upon himself, in emulation of a juggling trick achieved by his arch enemy at breakfast time, not even he fell half so readily into the snare prepared for him as the old lady did into this artful pitfall. The fact of Tackleton having walked out, and furthermore of 2 or 3 people having been talked together at a distance for 2 minutes, leaving her to her own resources, was quite enough to have put her on her dignity, and the bewailment of that mysterious convulsion in the indigo trade for 24 hours. But this becoming deference to her experience on the part of the young mother was so irresistible that after a short affectation of humility she began to enlighten her with the best grace in the world, and sitting bolt upright before the wicked Dot, she did, in half an hour, deliver more infallible domestic recipes and precepts than would, if acted on, have utterly destroyed and done up that young Peerybingle, though he had been an infant Samson. To change the theme, Dot did a little needlework. She carried the contents of a whole work-box in her pocket. However she contrived it, I don't know. Then did a little nursing, then a little more needlework, then had a little whispering chat with May, while the old lady dozed. And so, in little bits of bustle, which was quite her manner always, found it a very short afternoon. Then, as it grew dark, and as it was a solemn part of the institution of the picnic that she should perform all Bertha's household tasks, she trimmed the fire and swept the hearth, and set the tea-board out, and drew the curtain, and lighted a candle. Then she played an air or two on a rude kind of harp, which Caleb had contrived for Bertha, and played them very well, for nature had made her delicate little ear as choice a one for music as it would have been for jewels, if she had had any to wear. By this time it was the established hour of having tea, and Tackleton came back again to share the meal and spend the evening. Caleb and Bertha had returned some time before, and Caleb had sat down to his afternoon's work. But he couldn't settle to it, poor fellow, being anxious and remorseful for his daughter. It was touching to see him sitting idle on his working stool, regarding her so wistfully, and always saying in his face, "Have I deceived her from her cradle, but to break her heart?" When it was night and tea was done, and Dot had nothing more to do in washing up the cups and saucers. In a word, for I must come to it, and there is no use in putting it off, when the time drew nigh for expecting the carrier's return and every sound of distant wheels, her manner changed again. Her color came and went, and she was very restless. Not as good wives are when listening for their husbands. No, no, no. It was another sort of restlessness from that. Wheels heard, a horse's feet, the barking of a dog, the gradual approach of all the sounds, the scratching paw of Boxer at the door. "Whose step is that?" cried Bertha, starting up. "Whose step?" returned the carrier, standing in the portal, with his brown face ruddy as a winter berry from the keen night air. "Why, mine." "The other step," said Bertha. "The man's tread behind you." "She is not to be deceived," observed the carrier, laughing. "Come along, sir. You'll be welcome, never fear." He spoke in a loud tone, and as he spoke, the deaf old gentleman entered. "He's not so much a stranger and that you haven't seen him once, Caleb," said the carrier. "You'll give him house room till we go?" "Oh, surely, John, and take it as an honor." "He's the best company on earth to talk secrets in," said John. "I have reasonable good lungs, but he tries 'em, I can tell you. Sit down, sir. All friends here and glad to see you." When he had imparted this assurance in a voice that amply corroborated what he had said about his lungs, he added in his natural tone, "A chair in the chimney corner, and leave to sit quite silent and look pleasantly about him, is all he cares for. He's easily pleased." Bertha had been listening intently. She called Caleb to her side when he had set the chair, and asked him in a low voice to describe their visitor. When he had done so, truly now, with scrupulous fidelity, she moved for the first time since he had come in, and sighed, and seemed to have no further interest concerning him. The carrier was in high spirits, good fellow that he was, and fonder of his little wife than ever. "A clumsy dot she was, this afternoon," he said, encircling her with his rough arm as she stood, removed from the rest. "And yet I like her somehow. See yonder, Dot." He pointed to the old man. She looked down. I think she trembled. Ha ha ha! He's full of admiration for you," said the carrier. "Talked of nothing else the whole way here. Why, he's a brave old boy. I like him for it." "I wish he had had a better subject, John," she said, with an uneasy glance about the room, at Tackleton especially. "A better subject!" cried the jovial John. "There's no such thing. Come, off with the great coat, off with the thick shawl, off with the heavy wrappers, and a cozy half-hour by the fire. My humble service, mistress. A game of cribbage, you and I. That's hearty. The cards and board, Dot, and a glass of beer here if there's any left, small wife." His challenge was addressed to the old lady, who, accepting it with gracious readiness, they were soon engaged upon the game. At first the carrier looked about him sometimes with a smile, or now and then called Dot to peep over his shoulder at his hand, and advise him on some knotty point. But his adversary, being a rigid disciplinarian, and subject to an occasional weakness in respect of pegging more than she was entitled to, required such vigilance on his part as left him neither eyes nor ears to spare. Thus his whole attention gradually became absorbed upon the cards, and he thought of nothing else, until a hand upon his shoulder restored him to a consciousness of Tackleton. "I am sorry to disturb you, but a word, directly." "I'm going to deal," returned the carrier. "It's a crisis." "It is," said Tackleton. "Come here, man." There was that in his pale face which made the other rise immediately, and ask him in a hurry what the matter was. "Hush, John Peerybingle," said Tackleton. "I am sorry for this. I am indeed. I have been afraid of it. I have suspected it from the first." "What is it?" asked the carrier, with a frightened aspect. "Hush! I'll show you if you'll come with me." The carrier accompanied him without another word. They went across the yard where the stars were shining, and by a little side door into Tackleton's own counting-house, where there was a glass window commanding the warehouse, which was closed for the night. There was no light in the counting-house itself, but there were lamps in the long narrow ware-room, and consequently the window was bright. "A moment," said Tackleton. "Can you bear to look through that window, do you think?" "Why not?" returned the carrier. "A moment more," said Tackleton. "Don't commit any violence. It's of no use. It's dangerous, too. You're a strong-made man, and you might do murder before you know it." The carrier looked him in the face, and recoiled a step as if he had been struck. In one stride he was at the window, and he saw— Oh, shadow on the hearth! Oh, truthful cricket! Oh, perfidious wife! He saw her with the old man, old no longer, but erect and gallant, bearing in his hand the false white hair that had won his way into their desolate and miserable home. He saw her listening to him as he bent his head to whisper in her ear, and suffering him to clasp her round the waist as they moved slowly down the dim wooden gallery towards the door by which they had entered it. He saw them stop, and saw her turn, to have the face he loved so, presented to his view, and saw her, with her own hands, adjust the lie upon his head, laughing as she did it, at his unsuspicious nature. He clenched his strong right hand at first, as if it would have beaten down a lion, but opening it immediately again, he spread it out before the eyes of Tackleton, for he was tender of her even then, and so as they passed out, fell down upon a desk, and was as weak as any infant. He was wrapped up to the chin and busy with his horse and parcels when she came into the room, preparing for going home. "Now, John dear, good night, May. Good night, Bertha." Could she kiss them? Could she be blithe and cheerful in her parting? Could she venture to reveal her face to them without a blush? Yes, Tackleton observed her closely, and she did all this. Tilly was hushing the baby, and she crossed and recrossed Tackleton a dozen times, repeating drowsily, "Did the knowledge that it was to be its wife's, then, wring its hearts almost to breaking? And did its fathers deceive it from its cradles, but to break its hearts at last? Now, Tilly, give me the baby. Good night, Mr. Tackleton. Where is John, for goodness' sake?" "He's going to walk beside the horse's head," said Tackleton, who helped her to her seat. "My dear John, walk? To-night?" The muffled figure of her husband made a hasty sign in the affirmative, and the false stranger and the little nurse being in their places, the old horse moved off. Boxer, the unsuspicious Boxer, running on before, running back, running round and round the cart, and barking as triumphantly and merrily as ever. When Tackleton had gone off likewise, escorting May and her mother home, poor Caleb sat down by the fire beside his daughter, anxious and remorseful at the core, and still saying in his wistful contemplation of her, "Have I deceived her from her cradle, but to break her heart at last?" The toys that had been set in motion for the baby had all stopped and run down long ago. In the faint light and silence, the imperturbably calm dolls, the agitated rocking horses with distended eyes and nostrils, the old gentlemen at the street doors standing half doubled up upon their failing knees and ankles, the wry-faced nutcrackers, the very beasts upon their way into the ark, in twos like a boarding school out walking, might have been imagined to be stricken motionless with fantastic wonder at Dot being false or Tackleton beloved, under any combination of circumstances. Ooh, that's our scandalous conclusion to Chirp the Second. So we know that Dot has been talking with the older gentleman, who is not actually an older gentleman, but a young gentleman, and they seem to be having some sort of intimate conversation. Oh my goodness. So we will find out in Chirp the Third, our concluding chapter of our story. Unfortunately, it's going to take us 2 days to conclude, so I don't know if we're going to find out what's going on, because something seems suspicious here. We'll find out either tomorrow or on Wednesday as we conclude our read aloud together of The Cricket on the Hearth. In the meantime, I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I will see you tomorrow. Bye, friends.